Well, y'all hit the like goal and I kinda forgot about the series, but I'm back and I'm gonna dish out a episode as promised. Now same as the norm, if it hits 10 likes within a week then I make another vid quickly, if not then it's gonna be a when I feel like it kinda thing. Make sure to sub as well. The only reason I came back was the fact I gained a bunch of subs from the 2 episodes I dropped a few months back. I saw them on accident when I opened YT Studio with a misclick. That's all I got to say for now, so let's get into it. Ichigo sighed as his ears picked up the quickly approaching steps of his man-child of a father. He smoothly got off the bed and, after a few moments of consideration, turned and slid his window closed. Standing in front of his bed, he prepared himself for a usual morning in the Kurosaki household. Ishin kicked open his son's door and rushed inside. He was already executing a flying kick when he registered the fact that Ichigo had been lying in wait for him, with an unreadable look in his eyes. In a graceful twirl, his son spun away from his assault, leaving him to sail uninterruptedly out of his window, as usual. He only just noticed that the window had in fact been closed when his body broke through the pane of glass. With a startled yelp at the unexpected obstruction, he went crashing down to the unforgiving ground in a shower of broken glass. Ichigo glanced out his window to see his father moaning in pain on the floor, and yet his sharp eyes easily noted the lack of cuts or injuries on his body, which one might expect after going through a pane of glass. With a faint smirk on his lips, he turned to leave his room, intending to perform his usual morning rituals in preparation for school. Ichigo hesitated momentarily as he entered his classroom, the hitch in his stride too short for anyone present to notice. Without giving anything away, he continued onto his desk, and as he sat down, his eyes flickered in the direction of a black-haired slim student seating somewhere in front of him. He refocused on his surroundings once he felt the presence of Inoue next to his desk, sparing a moment to think, that is, Ishida are you, if I recall correctly, interesting. Morning, Ichigo. Turning, Ichigo returned Tatsuki's greeting, as well as Anu's and Chad's after that. The niceties out of the way, Tatsuki said. Ichigo, I passed by your house earlier and saw a big hole in your wall. Trailing off in obvious question, Tatsuki waited for Ichigo to elaborate, while Chad and Inoue focused in on him in interest as well. With a shrug, Ichigo fed them the story of a runaway truck, allaying their fears about the well-being of his family, mentioning that they suffered slight bruises at worst. All talking in the classroom suddenly ceased once the teacher strolled in to begin homeroom. However, excited whispers broke out as soon as the teens noticed another shorter figure trailing after their teacher. With a huff of exasperation, the teacher called them back to order and said, "Class, I'd like you to meet Kuchiki Rukia-san. She is a new transfer, so please make her feel at home." The petite brunette stepped forward and with a bow, she spoke to the rest of the class, "Hello, my name is Kuchiki Rukia, pleased to meet you." Immediately, most of the boys in the class began to whisper about the cute new transfer, while the girls talked about getting her alone to learn more about her. The teacher's voice brought them back to the matter at hand. "Kuchiki-san, feel free to take the seat beside Kurosaki-san over there." With a nod of her head, Rukia made her way to the desk beside Ichigo, all the while ignoring the attention of her new classmates. Once she got to his location, she plastered a fake smile on her face and extended her hand while saying, "Hello, Kurosaki-san, nice to meet you." Ichigo's gaze dropped to her hand where he noticed some writing, which read, "Make a scene and I'll kill you." His eyes narrowed minutely after reading the message, before they gained an indifferent look in them. Giving no reaction whatsoever to reveal his inner thoughts, Ichigo turned back to face the front of the class, in time to hear the teacher call for the attention of the students. It was going to be a long day. Rukia observed the orange-haired teen from the corner of her eye. After she had endured an extensive questioning from him, she had been too tired to do anything but rest. However, she remembered waking up a while later to find him asleep on a spare futon. She had taken the chance to remove herself from his room and track down a certain annoying shopkeeper to facilitate her integration into the human world. Now, she watched the child who possessed her powers pay attention to his teacher, and wondered how she was going to explain to him that he would be taking over her duties, unfailingly. The moment the bell for lunch went off, Keigo was out of his seat like a shot, sight fixed on his friend's orange hair, determined to get all the info Ichigo might have about the newcomer. He arrived at just about the same time as Chad, Inoue, and Tatsuki. But before any of them could speak, Ichigo said, "Fancy running into you again, Kuchiki-san. I had no idea you would be attending school with us. I would have pegged you as too. Old." Rukia's eyes flashed at that last statement, but before she could tear into the calm-looking teen before her, Keigo interrupted. "You know her, Ichigo. Why didn't you tell me, huh? You're trying to hoard all the girls to yourself, so greedy." With an amused look in Kyo's direction, Ichigo responded. "Not really. No, I met her 2 nights ago, when the truck ran into our house. She was a passerby who got slightly injured during the accident." Inoue immediately began to fuss over Rukia, asking if she had fully recovered and telling her to feel free to ask if she needed anything. With a slightly uncomfortable smile at the attention, Rukia said, "I'm fine, thank you, Orihime-san, though if you don't mind, I'd like to talk to Kurosaki-san about something." On that note, and with the rest of the gathered students watching on, Rukia took a hold of Ichigo and dragged him up to the roof, hoping to find some privacy there. Ignoring the whispers that followed them once students saw just whom it was that she was dragging along, Rukia cast a look back at Ichigo to find a vastly amused look on his face. Somehow, she got the impression that he was just humoring her. A few feet from their destination, Ichigo stopped, causing Rukia to stumble backwards and almost fall, if not for the steadying hand suddenly gripping her shoulder. Whirling around to question why he had just stopped, she abruptly stilled when she met his eyes. Having grown up a Kuchiki, Rukia had long since learned to read any situation she found herself in and subsequently take control of it, manipulating things to her benefit. It was a skill she wished she never needed, but one she was practical enough to know was necessary. She had initially thought that her decades of experience would give her an easy win with the teenager who was about a tenth her age, yet the look in his eyes told her that she had been dead wrong. The look in his eyes reminded her of her cold brother, and she just barely overcame the temptation to step back. Satisfied that the Shinigami had gotten the message, Ichigo took his eyes off her and proceeded to lead the way to their destination. Emerging onto the roof, he took a moment to take in the shining sun, feeling a hum of approval from his partner in the depths of his soul. Turning, he came to face Rukia, noting that she had taken the time to regain her composure, as indicated by her slightly raised chin when their eyes met. Stifling the smile that wanted to show at her display, he motioned for her to speak. Squaring her shoulders and fixing him with her stern violet gaze, Rukia spoke in a serious tone. "As I'm sure you recall from our talks, there are certain duties we Shinigami perform on a daily basis, duties which help to preserve the balance of 3 worlds. Now, since I don't have my powers at the moment, I expect you to take over said duties until such a time as I can return to them." Silence greeted her statement. Demand, and she waited with bated breath for some sort of reaction. Already, she had begun to mentally prepare a host reasons to make him reconsider in case he responded negatively. She needn't have bothered. With a slightly weary sigh, Ichigo said, "I suppose it is only fair that I cover for you until you recover." Seeing Rukia's look of surprise melt into a smile, he continued before she got carried away with herself. "There are, of course, conditions that must be met for me to completely agree to your request. First off, you will never lie to me if I ask you a question. I understand that there will be things that you might be unable to tell me, either because they are personal or because they are not yours to tell. However, if that were the case, I expect you tell me plainly that the subject is personal, or is not yours to talk about. I will extend the same courtesy to you in return. Waiting for her to mull over his words, he accepted her nod as agreement and proceeded with his second condition. I will approach my new Shinigami duties my own way. That is not say that I will not welcome advice from you, you have been doing this longer than I have after all. What I mean is that at the end of the day, the final call will be mine. Rukia's narrowed eyes clearly expressed her thoughts about his second condition. This time, her nod, when it came, was noticeably more reluctant than it had been before. With a nod of his own, Ichigo prepared to give the final condition. His eyebrows drew down in a chilling scowl, and his eyes flashed an arctic blue as he subconsciously tapped into his Ryutsu. When he spoke, the very air in Rukia's lungs stilled in fear at how lethal the teenager before her sounded. My final condition, and the most important of them all, is that my sisters, and friends, will be kept away from anything to do with the afterlife, unless there is absolutely no choice in the matter. I will not have harm befalling them if I can help it, not from any hollows, and not from you. Rukia shivered faintly when she saw the promise of deadly violence in Ichigo's eyes. She could do nothing but nod in agreement to that last request, much too fearful to risk incurring the teen's wrath. Seeing her acceptance, Ichigo blinked, and just like that, everything was back to normal, leaving Rukia startled at the abrupt change. Taking a moment to compose herself, Rukia turned back to face Ichigo just in time to hear his question. The fact that my classmates can interact with you suggests that you were able to procure a gigai, I believe was the term. Rukia nodded in response, vaguely recalling that she had mentioned gigas during her interrogation. Ichigo continued. In that case, can I correctly assume that you have settled the issue of your housing? Rukia twitched, and suddenly began hoping that Ichigo hadn't caught it, though the look in his eyes suggested that her prayers were for naught. Plastering on a fake smile on her face, she said in faux cheery tone. Ah, you need not worry about that, it's all been taken care of. Ichigo's brows drew down slightly as a faint scowl took over his expression. He spoke up slowly, clearly enunciating his words for maximum effect. Kuchiki-san, given that I will be substituting for you, don't you think that it is a good idea if I know where I can find you if the need ever arises? Unless, of course, you had planned to camp out in my house. The last statement, spoken in jest, startled Rukia a bit, causing her eyes to widen and her cheeks to flush almost unnoticeably. Ichigo abruptly straightened as his gaze sharpened when he took in her reaction. At this point, Rukia knew that her reaction had given her away and that any attempt to lie to the teen might backfire superbly. So, with a put-upon sigh, she said, Yes, I was going to stay in your room. From what I remember, there was a closet there that would be sufficient for me. During her explanation, Rukia refused to look at Ichigo, focusing instead on the school field located a ways away. With an exasperated sigh, Ichigo said, And when did you plan on telling me this? Seeing her slight flinch, he sighed once more. Fine, but I will not have you sneaking in. I will introduce you to the rest of my family. I'm sure they will not mind your presence, though you will have to put up with my father. Before she could ask for the meaning of that last statement, the door to the roof was flung open as Keigo and the rest of Ichigo's friends emerged onto the roof. With a mental note to be on guard when she met Kurosaki Isshin, Rukia moved forward at Ichigo's invitation to be properly introduced to his friends. Since that day was one of the days when Isshin picked the girls from school, Ichigo had no qualms with following Rukia after she mentioned that she needed to pick up some supplies from somewhere. He had long since deduced that there must have been a Shinigami supplier in the vicinity after he learned that Rukia had procured a gigai in town. Following her, he answered whatever questions she had about the living world, absently musing that, in some sense, Shinigami must live a relatively sheltered life. Finally, they arrived at a little shop that read Urahara Shouten, Urahara Shop. With a soft knock, Rukia opened the door and stepped in, Ichigo following after her. Suddenly, Ichigo's senses prickled and his eyes cut to a door, which then began to slide open. The moment his eyes landed on the green-clothed figure standing in the doorway, he experienced a flashback to the day of his mother's funeral. Talking with zangetsu had left him able to recall such memories without any of the pain usually associated with them, and so, this time around he was able to focus on other parts of the memory. He vaguely remembered the blonde newcomer before him, standing beside his father in the rain, as well as a white-haired young man and a purple-haired dark-skinned lady. Though their features were hazy, he knew with certainty that the figure wearing the green and white getup, as well as ridiculous Geta sandals, was the same man. Another piece of evidence to support my theory. Ever the keen one, Kazuki did not miss Ichigo's pause and subsequent scrutiny, but he put it aside for the time and prepared to play the part of the annoyingly cheery shopkeeper. Whipping out his fan from places unseen, he called out while covering the lower half of his face. "Kuchiki-san," and guessed, what a pleasant surprise. I was not expecting you. Tell me, what can this humble shopkeeper do for you? Huffing at the man's eccentricities, Rukia motioned to Ichigo, "This is Kurosaki Ichigo, and Ichigo, this is Urahara Kazuki." Ichigo inclined his head to Kazuki, who responded in kind, interested glint visibly shining in his piercing gray eyes. Turning to face him, Rukia continued. "I need one of those gloves you showed me before, as well as my things, which I left here this morning." Fluttering his fan in front of his face, Kazuki beamed out, "Of course, Kuchiki-san." Without warning, the door to the side of the three people slid open, allowing in a towering dark-skinned man with dreadlocks, in whose hands was a suitcase, as well as a red glove with an emblem of a skull. Rukia accepted the items from the newcomer with a grateful bow of her head, and then turned to leave, motioning for Ichigo to follow. With one last thoughtful look thrown at the blonde before him, Ichigo followed Rukia out as Kisuke's cheery voice floated out after them, "Be sure to stop by next time you need something, I'll even throw in a discount for you too." His intelligent gray eyes trailed the two as they finally left the shop, before his hand came up to drag his hat down to shade his eyes. "Interesting son you have there, Ishin." A few minutes after leaving the shop, Ichigo and Rukia were walking through the park on the way to Ichigo's home. Rukia was explaining the use of the glove in her hand, as well as the detector in her phone, which would warn them of any hollow presence in the vicinity. Just as she was preparing to put it back in her pocket, Ichigo's senses went on alert and he turned just in time to see a young girl emerge from the tree line, panting and scuffed up. She had a chain sticking out of her chest. Rukia's hand was already sliding into the glove as the phone began to let out a beep. Without waiting for Ichigo to turn to face her, her hand plunged into his back, forcing his soul out of his body. Ichigo didn't even stumble as he was ejected out of his human body, he was already blurring across the ground towards the stumbling child. He was a few steps away from her when her head came up and she saw the approaching orange-haired black-clad figure, frightening scowl on his face, and right hand already reaching for the huge sword on his back. She squeaked in fear and dropped to her knees in preparation for an attack that never came. A shadow passing over her made her glance up to find that the scary teen had jumped moments before hitting her, targeting something behind her. She spun around just in time to watch him remove the two front limbs of the spider-like monster that had chased her so far. Rukia's brows furrowed as she observed Ichigo dash towards the panting plus soul. She was confused because her senses were telling her that Ichigo had grown more powerful since the last time she had seen him in his Shinigami garb. Finally, after a few more moments of contemplation, she dismissed the thought as ludicrous. Obviously, she thought, I wasn't paying proper attention at the time since I was injured. Refocusing on the here and now, she immediately ran forward to tend to the poor child and get her out of harm's way. Ichigo landed smoothly and spun to face the screeching form of the spider hollow. He hefted his blade and fluidly moved to re-engage his foe. Ducking under a retaliatory strike from the wounded monster, he struck out and removed the offending limb before it could be retracted. Now missing 3 legs, The hollow roared in pain moments before it shifted its weight in preparation for another attack, forgetting to compensate for the loss of limbs. With no forewarning, the hollow overbalanced and wavered in the air for a moment of weakness. Ichigo ruthlessly capitalized on it. Seeing his enemy focused on regaining its balance, Ichigo jumped towards its face, wasting no time in cleaving its head into two, purifying the tortured soul and rescuing its intended prey. Landing gracefully on his feet, he turned to search for the girl and found her being comforted by Rukia. Plastering on a smile that he usually reserved for his little sisters, Ichigo slowly approached the duo, ignoring Rukia's startled look at his suddenly gentle countenance. Long experience had him bracing for impact just as the child flung herself at him, crying in relief and thanking him for saving her. He spent a few moments getting her to calm down before finally moving to send her onwards. He listened to Rukia's instructions about performing kansu, soul burial, and then gently performed the rite on the smiling child, answering smile on his own face. Paying no heed to Rukia's teasing smile at how gentle he was with the little girl, he moved forward to return to his body, despairing at the dirt on his person caused by his haste to cleanse the hollow. He mentally vowed to find a better way to exit his body without leaving it to flop down in a mess. Getting back to his feet, now in his body, Ichigo turned to resume the journey home, still blatantly ignoring Rukia's attempts to tease him. Rukia watched as Ichigo opened the door to his home and entered first. She was just about to follow after him when she noticed a quickly approaching white-clad figure. She gaped in stunned confusion as she witnessed Ichigo fend off attacks from, who was without a doubt, his father. Ichigo, obviously getting tired of the man's actions, executed a deft ducking twisting spinning kick that resulted in Ishin's face impacting the wall beside him. As the groaning lump of pain that was his dad slumped to the floor, Ichigo casually stepped over his twitching form to receive the welcome greetings of his two sisters. With that out of the way, he turned to face Rukia, causing Karen and Yuzu to take notice of her presence, and said, "This is Kuchiki Rukia. If it's alright with you, she'll be staying with us for some time." At the mention of her name, Ishin twitched minutely, an action caught by Ichigo's sharp gaze. Ichigo did not even bat an eyelid when Ishin was suddenly standing in front of the very startled Rukia, poking and prodding her relentlessly. He promptly abandoned her to his tender mercies and turned a questioning look on his two sisters. Karen's indifferent shrug and Yuzu's beaming smile were all the answers he needed. With a nod of his head, he ascended the stairs to his room, intending to change out of his school clothes and settle in before dinner. Rukia finally managed to extract herself from the evil clutches of the man-child downstairs, fleeing to Ichigo's room with shouted things like, "Come back, new daughter. Daddy wants a hug," chasing her as she escaped. She finally burst into Ichigo's room and slammed the door behind her, taking a moment to let her heart stop racing. She glanced at Ichigo to find him placidly looking back at her, with the amusement in his eyes the only sign that he had enjoyed what had happened to her. Huffing at the orange-haired teen, she moved forward to take a seat at the desk in his room, finally taking the time to observe his room. It was surprisingly clean for a teenage boy, though she somehow found herself unsurprised by that revelation. After she had looked her fill, she turned back to Ichigo, wondering what would happen next. She needn't have worried because Yuzu's voice suddenly rang out, calling them to dinner. She followed Ichigo downstairs and took a seat beside him, facing his black-haired sister. The rest of the family promptly seated themselves as well, with Ishin taking the head of the table for the first since Masaki had died. During the meal, Ichigo subtly observed his dad, watching for any reaction on his face that would give away his knowledge of who Rukia really was. He found none. Similarly, Rukia acted as though she had no idea that Ishin was more than he appeared, and he was grateful that he hadn't made a mistake in bringing her to his house. He worried that his actions would have revealed Ishin to Soul Society. As soon as the meal was finished, Ichigo ushered his sisters and Rukia upstairs, telling Karen and Yuzu to check if they had clothes they could spare for Rukia. he and Ishin would handle the dishes. Dragging his protesting father by the collar, he entered the kitchen, plates balanced in his free hand. Ishin finally relented and joined him in washing the dishes, surprisingly quiet for once. Ichigo was not oblivious to the looks his father threw at him at regular intervals, he just chose to ignore them. It was obvious to him that Ishin had realized that Ichigo wanted to talk to him about something important. Why else would he actively seek to be alone with his crazy dad? Still, he worried about how to broach the topic he wanted to discuss with his father, dilly-dallying for so long that he finished washing the dishes. Finally, he felt a wave of assurance originating from the depths of his soul, banishing his fears and reminding him, never hesitate, never retreat. Deciding not to draw it out, Ichigo began. So, I'm guessing, from her lack of reaction, that Rukia was not in your division before you left Soul Society. Ishin's hand froze in the process of putting the last clean dish back in the rack, his suddenly numb fingers only just managing not to let it slip and shatter on the floor. Automatically, a goofy smile spread across his face and his mouth opened to boisterously deflect Ichigo's question, but one glance at his son's serious eyes caused his breath to catch in his throat and the smile to slowly slip off his face. With a weary and resigned sigh, Ishin placed the last of the dishes in its place and turned to speak to his son. The only thing running through his mind was, how did he figure it out, Kazuki? No, he wouldn't have told him. However, before Ishin could speak, Ichigo continued. You don't owe me any explanations. I will wait for you to tell me if you want to, and only when you want to. I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't causing you any problems by bringing her here. Now certain that his son knew his secret, Ishin prepared to deal with the anger and hate Ichigo must be feeling because Ishin hadn't been able to save Masaki. Suddenly, Ichigo's gaze, which had been focused on Ishin throughout his speech, shifted to the side, zeroing in on the wall behind his dad, while a very faint flush crept in a line across his face. His next words were spoken at such a low volume that Ishin had to concentrate to hear them. And he was glad that he did. Also, I figured that there must be a reason why you don't use your Shinigami powers. Why you didn't use them on that night. Not daring to hope, Ishin waited for Ichigo to continue speaking, wondering if it was indeed possible that his son did not blame him, even when Ishin blamed himself. I remember how you looked when you told me what had happened, and I don't think it's your fault that mom died. I know that you beat yourself up over it, and now I understand why, but you are the one who told me not to blame myself, so you don't get the right to do it to yourself. I know that the only reason you didn't save her that night was because you couldn't. Nothing else would have stopped you from intervening if you could. So, even though you have this secret, it doesn't change the fact that I know you love, Mom, and that you're still my dad. Ishin's jaw clenched fiercely as his eyes gained a suspicious shine in them at Ichigo's heartfelt words. Unable to help himself, he reached out to hug his son for the first time in years, surprised when Ichigo didn't punch him like he usually did, but instead, returned the hug just as strongly. With his arms fiercely hugging the teen, Ishin murmured. I am so proud of you, Ichigo, my son, always have been, and always will be, thank you for understanding. Ishin finally disengaged from him and, after casting him a thoughtful look, muttered a wait here and promptly vanished. Ichigo blinked in surprise at his dad's sudden disappearance, but he didn't have to wait for long, though he did take the time to fully regain his composure. Ishin came back downstairs clutching a moderately sized box in his two hands, stopping to motion Ichigo into the dining room before following after him. He placed the box on the table and, with a flourish, he flung open the lid, revealing a few old books, some scrolls, and other odds and ends. Perplexed at what he was seeing, Ichigo reached in to pick up one of the books sitting before him. Blowing off the little bit of dust on it, he peered at the title and promptly gaped in shock. It read, Introduction to Ryutsu Control. Slowly, He turned his eyes up to look at his dad and received a smug look in return. Ishin then spoke up. It isn't much, and I don't really know why I hung onto them for so long, but there are a few instruction manuals and books there, as well as some mementos from my time in the Spiritual Arts Academy and as captain of the 10th Division. Ichigo's already wide eyes widened even further and he stuttered out, "Wait, what, Captain?" Blinking at that, Ishin suddenly realized that Ichigo might not have known that he had been a captain, he might have thought him just a regular Shinigami. With furrowed brows, he asked, "Wait, you didn't know? Then, why did you ask about her being in my division?" Finally getting a hold of himself, Ichigo sighed. "I just thought that you were a Shinigami who defected and then met Mom. It seemed too unlikely that Soul Society would just let a captain vanish without a trace, unless you faked your death, of course." Smirking mysteriously at his son, Ishin refrained from responding. Instead, he placed the removed book back into the box and shut it. Leaving it sitting in front of his son, he began to make his way to bed, stopping to pat Ichigo on the shoulder and to leave him to take in all the recent revelations. Just before he passed out of sight, he spun and shouted in a voice so clear that people next door must have heard him. "Make sure to use protection, Ichigo." And then he promptly ducked out of the way, narrowly dodging the eating knife that embedded itself in the wall where his head had been a scant few seconds before. Laughing uproariously, he finally made his way to his bedroom to end the day, thinking along the way, "You must be so proud of him. Huh. Masaki." Ichigo finally stood and gathered the box to take it to his room, mind already worrying with thoughts of where to hide it so that Rukia would never see its contents. Ichigo did not trust the Shinigami enough to let her glimpse a secret so important to his family as a whole. He knew the views held by the Soul Society on such matters, and he also knew that as a Kuchiki noble, Rukia would probably observe the laws more strictly. He had long since decided that it would be in his best interest if he gave her no reason to think that there was more to him than met the eye. That meant that she could never know that he had gotten in touch with his own Zanpakuto, or that he had access to the knowledge contained in the books he had just received. As far as he was concerned, there were only two possible ways things could go. Either Rukia eventually gained his trust, at which point he might share some things with her, things which she would then be forced to keep from Soul Society, which would want to learn everything that she had, or she would choose Soul Society over him when the time came, in which case they would consider him more of a threat and be more severe in their reaction. Regardless of which ended up being true, it was best for all involved if he played his cards close to his chest. Ichigo entered his room to find that Rukia was nowhere in sight, but he could pick up the faint sounds of keystrokes emanating from his cupboard. Taking the chance to stash his box without her noticing, he hid the box under his bed in the meantime, arranging his beddings to make things seem undisturbed. Turning, he stepped up to the cupboard and knocked. It slid open to reveal Rukia clad in one of Yuzu's sleeping wears, lying in the upper section of his closet. Ichigo asked, "Comfortable in there?" Rukia nodded, and then promptly slid the door back closed. Blinking at her actions, he shook his head but decided not to look a gift horse in the mouth. Returning to his bed, he withdrew the box and removed the introductory book on Ryutsu control, as well as an introduction to one of the four main spiritual arts, Ho-Ho, high-speed movement. Sensing that Zangetsu was paying attention to what he was about to do, Ichigo settled down to study the two books, glad that they were relatively thin books and would not take him too long to read through. Within the first few minutes of reading the Ryutsu manual, it was painfully obvious that Ichigo already had it down pat. Indeed, he had already begun to adapt most of his mediation exercises from his martial arts to handle the sudden onset of his Ryutsu, exercises which the book listed as basics of Ryutsu control. He was glad that he had already learned the basics and could progress with more challenging exercises. The book mentioned that once the basics were mastered, culminating in the Shinigami finally succeeding at Jinzen, sword meditation, the next steps were to begin actively utilizing the Ryutsu for things like Kido, demon arts, and Ho-Ho. It claimed that the more one used their ryutsu, the more their ryutsu grew in sheer amount and potency, while also ensuring that they grew more familiar with their power and gained better control of it. A half hour later, he was putting the first book aside and reaching for the second, eager to find out about what kind of high-speed movements he could learn. He was momentarily disappointed once he realized, a few pages in, that the only technique available to most Shinigami was shunpo, flash step. Before his disappointed feelings could fully take root, he felt a gentle wave of admonishment from zangetsu, snapping him out of his thoughts and making him reconsider. His lessons had taught him that one could take something simple, and do something extraordinary. So, maybe the Shinigami only had shunpo, not because they didn't have anything better, but because they didn't need anything better. Sending back feelings of gratitude towards his partner, Ichigo refocused on the book, determined to grasp the concepts presented. An hour later, he leaned back in his chair, mind filled with all the things he had just learned. Without warning, he burst into motion, moving silently. He locked the two books in his bottommost drawer and then went to his bed, lying on his back and preparing to slip into his inner world. Ever since he had learned that whatever happened to his spiritual body affected his human body in some form, he had decided that he would substitute his usual nightly exercises for ones in his inner world. Of course, as his injuries had shown him, the transfer of changes was not one-to-one, but given the intensity of the workout he would get from sparring with zangetsu, he concluded that his human body would still gain significant benefits. A few talks with zangetsu had also suggested that the stronger his human body became, the stronger his soul would be in turn, and the more he could push his spiritual form to improve, which in turn would strengthen his body further. It would be a continuous cycle of improvements in steadily increasing leaps and bounds. Of course, they theorized that the only reason that Ichigo could gain such a benefit was because he was still essentially human and his soul was still malleable, so to speak. It hadn't yet been cut off from his body by true death and so still possessed the ability to rapidly evolve. In a transition so smooth he barely felt it, Ichigo found himself in his inner world, facing his black-clad stoic companion. Without a single word, Zangetsu brought forward his right hand, revealing the broad katana clasped in it. Echoing his movement, Ichigo materialized his own sword, and at an unseen signal, he lunged at Zangetsu. Right from the get-go, he gave it all he had, not pulling any punches and pushing himself as hard as he could. He parried, thrust, countered, and swiped and still he could not touch the older man. He was not disheartened. Pushing out all distracting thoughts, he lost himself to the motions of their fight, unconsciously incorporating clever moves that Zangetsu had used in their previous spar and making them his own. Zangetsu, for his part, was immensely pleased with the progress that he was seeing. True, it was only their second spar so far, but already, he was seeing some visible improvement in the areas that he had pointed out to his wielder previously. Still, Ichigo had some ways to go before he could match him, and with his next few attacks, he reminded the orange-haired teen of that fact. Finally, after about 2 hours, Zangetsu disengaged from Ichigo and paused in his assault. Curious about the abrupt end, Ichigo also dropped out of his offensive stance, though he was still on guard. Seeing that he had his wielder's attention, Zangetsu focused, and ignoring the feeling of gathering ryutsu in the air, he grasped his sword and twisted, and Ichigo gasped. Where before they had been holding broadswords, now they held the more traditional katanas, though slightly longer than usual, yet not the length of an odachi. Ichigo took the time to study his new blade. This is zangetsu, he thought to himself. It had a black handle, with a short dark red ribbon attached to the base of the handle. Its blade was a long and slightly curved silver length of cool, unyielding depth, though at certain angles, it seemed to flash black. Simply looking at it, he felt the same regal and unshakable aura of strength that usually surrounded Zangetsu, further confirming for him that this was his sword. Moving his hand about, to get a feel for the sword, he was pleased with the feeling of rightness that the blade gave him. how it responded as though it were already an extension of his form, singing through the air in heady anticipation. With a pleased smile on his face, he raised his gaze to meet the eyes of his silent companion. Smoothly sliding into a stance that suited the smaller sword, he had to fight down more feelings of giddiness that threatened to overwhelm him at how much easier it was to wield his actual sword. Seeing a small smile spread across Zangetsu's face, Ichigo realized that he must have been projecting his feelings, yet he couldn't find it in himself to care. Seeing that his wielder was ready to continue, Zangetsu blurred forward, blade gracefully and effortlessly cutting through the air on a straight course for Ichigo's throat. With a deft and easy twist, Ichigo's sword was suddenly in the path of the incoming attack, deflecting it away from him. Not letting up for an instant, Zangetsu struck again and again, exhilarated that his wielder could finally use him, and not some sword tainted by another's power. The two combatants lost track of time as they fought each other, bodies a blur as they struck at high speeds, both unconsciously using their ryutsu to facilitate such high-speed movement, a precursor to shunpo. A few hours in, Ichigo was beginning to tire, allowing attacks that he might have previously blocked to bypass his guard. Zangetsu, sensing weakness, suddenly flickered out of view, and Ichigo, wide-eyed, froze when he felt the cool point of a blade under his chin. Slowly, his bewildered gaze rose to meet the equally surprised eyes of his Zanpakuto, until together, they both broke out into small smiles of accomplishment, without a doubt, that had been shunpo. Not for the first time since meeting Zangetsu, Ichigo found himself feeling grateful and happy that he had been gifted with such a companion. Truly, he could ask for no better partner. Without wasting any time, and also ignoring the various aches and pains he was feeling, Ichigo sought to learn from Zangetsu how to perform the technique. It took a few tries, but eventually, Ichigo was able to achieve short-distance bursts of shunpo. Now, all that was left was practice to fully master it. Finally acknowledging his injuries, Ichigo flopped down on the roof of the building they had been fighting on, and collapsed onto his back in fatigue. He waited to catch his breath as he felt his depleted ryutsu stores slowly refill themselves. With a groan, he realized that he would be sore in so many places tomorrow. Still, he thought to himself, I wouldn't have it any other way. Eventually, having somewhat recovered, he raised himself into a seating position and looked at Zangetsu, who was standing at the edge not too far away and gazing out at the scenery before him. He let loose a slight huff when he found that the older man wasn't even breathing hard, and for a moment, he had to fight down burgeoning feelings of frustration. However, his partner's soothing baritone drew him out of his thoughts. Do not concern yourself about such things, Ichigo. We are one, you and I. As you grow stronger, so do I individually. We grow stronger by ourselves, and so, when we fight together against a foe, we would have improved twice as much, we would be twice as strong. I can hardly expect you to keep advancing if I don't do the same myself, can I? Blinking at what Zangetsu had just said, Ichigo realized that he was indeed correct. The more they sparred, the stronger Ichigo grew. The stronger he grew, the more powerful his Zanpakuto became. The more powerful Zangetsu got, the more challenge he provided to Ichigo, and so, the more Ichigo advanced from sparring with him. With a sigh, he aimed a smile of gratitude at his companion, and got to his feet to stand beside him, to stand with him. Turning to look at the rest of his inner world, Ichigo asked, were you able to investigate the remnants of Rukia's power? With a slight incline of his head, Zangetsu responded. Indeed I was, and I found that you were correct. I was able to glean bits and pieces of information concerning how Shinigami use ryutsu, as well as some things about the workings of the Soul Society that she had neglected to mention. The fragments of information, as well as the books your father gave you, should help us be better prepared for the inevitable upcoming confrontation with Soul Society. With a nod of understanding, Ichigo refocused on the scenery in front of them, absently playing with his ryutsu to stir up a cooling breeze. After a few moments just observing, he finally let loose a sigh and turned once more to face Zangetsu. Seeing the tacit nod offered back to him, he allowed a small smile to show on his face as he slowly faded out of view, returning to the outside world. Getting up, Ichigo quietly retrieved some muscle balm and tended to the numerous little cuts and bruises that had appeared on his human body, sparing a moment to be grateful that none of them would be visible once he hot-dressed tomorrow. Rukia glanced at the orange-haired teen walking beside her as they left to pick up Ichigo's sisters. It had been a few days since she had moved into his home and she found herself thinking about what she had learned about the teen so far. She had watched him interact with his sisters and she had seen that beneath his stoic, and sometimes scowling, visage, there was an older brother who dearly loved his little sisters. Occasionally, she had to fight off a surge of jealousy when she compared Ichigo to her own brother, before she would then forcibly dismiss the thoughts from her head. She was glad that Ichigo took the time to actually talk to her and answer the numerous questions she had about the living world. He had even gone so far as to take her shopping for some things, using her own money of course. He was more mature than most of the people she had met, a fact that amazed her when she recalled that he was merely 15 years old. Still, she found that she didn't mind spending time with him, even though he never went out of his way to be especially open with her. It had taken a few days for her to realize that no matter how at ease Ichigo had seemed with her, he still kept from sharing personal things about himself. Not surprising, since they had only known each other for a few days, so she didn't let it bother her. As long as they kept their agreement to never explicitly lie to each other, she would refrain from invading his personal business. The past few days had seen a steady decrease in hollow appearances as word spread that hollows who went to Karakura town never returned. Watching Ichigo tackle the various monsters that invaded the town, Rukia had to accept that he seemed to be improving with every battle. At first, she had wondered if he was getting instruction from someone else, but observing him for a whole day had revealed that he wasn't sneaking out at night to train, so she dismissed that thought. Eventually, she had decided that he was simply getting used to his new powers, a reasonable conclusion, since no one would expect a mere 15-year-old human boy to know the first thing about monster slaying from the get-go. The faint sound of her name being called from afar caused her to pause in her stride and turn backwards. She smiled when she recognized the approaching form of Inoue, right hand waving in the air while her left clutched a bag of groceries. Ichigo sat on his bed, reading the last page of one of his school books in preparation for a test the next day. His mind wasn't too focused on the task at hand since he had already studied and was only revising. Instead, he was thinking back to the encounter he and Rukia had had with Inoue earlier in the day. He had noticed the mark on her leg, reminiscent of a giant handprint, as well as the faint hollow sensation the injury gave off. With a furrowed brow, he turned to Rukia and said, "Hey Rukia, mind removing me from my body now? I don't want to have to start scrambling if I need to take care of a hollow later in the night." Blinking a little in surprise, Rukia suddenly felt the urge to face palm in embarrassment at failing to think of such an obvious solution to the problem of preparing for hollows in the night. Wasting no more time, she put on the special glove and pushed on Ichigo's chest. With a muted flash of light, Ichigo's soul was ejected from his body, which he then caught and laid down in a comfortable position on his bed. Turning back to Rukia, who was sitting in a chair by his bed, he prepared to thank her when his eyes abruptly widened in alarm as his senses went haywire. Before Rukia could react to the sudden beeping of her cell phone, Ichigo kicked her chair, causing it to roll away from the bed and towards the door, carrying her to safety. In the same motion, he rolled backwards, ending up in a handstand on his bed, just in time to dodge the clawed hand that crashed into the ground previously occupied by Rukia and his legs. Spinning on his planted hand, he lashed out with a powerful Ryutsu charged kick, which harshly connected with the mask of the hollow. With a sharp crack, a chunk of bone shattered off the top right portion of the hollow's mask, revealing its right eye and some of the face beneath. With a roar of pain, the hollow swiftly retreated into a black portal to recover from its wounds. Before it completely vanished, however, its serpentine tail lashed out at Rukia, who was too slow to dodge. With a yelp, Rukia was smashed into the wall of Ichigo's room, where she slumped down in pain. As she noticed Ichigo take a step in her direction, she shouted at him, "I'm fine. Go. Chase after it." With only one more glance in her direction, Ichigo leapt out his window, following his instincts and rushing towards Orihime's home. The moment he knew that he was out of sight of his house, he vanished in a flicker of Ryutsu. The hollow once known as Inoue Sora gazed into the window of his former home, watching as Orihime and Tatsuki held a conversation while Orihime cooked. Just as he prepared to crash into the room, a surge of Ryutsu had him turning to look behind him, where he found the figure of the orange-haired Shinigami that had injured him, standing in midair and gazing calmly back at him. Snarling in rage, he spat a glob of acid at Ichigo, who merely flickered out of the way. Before the hollow could launch another attack, Ichigo spoke 2 words. Inoue Sora. The snake-like hollow stilled completely, eyes blank as that name threatened to bring back a lifetime of memories. Furiously shaking its head, it screamed out in a voice that was double-toned and downright shiver-inducing. You're the one who took her from me. You're the reason she forgot me." With a bellow of rage, he launched himself at Ichigo, who calmly intercepted his hand with the flat of his broad katana and then smacked him away with it. Crashing into the ground below, the hollow groaned in pain, before it tried to drag itself out of the hole it had just created on impact. Before it could get too far, Ichigo materialized next to it and kicked it in its torso, launching it back up into the air, where he then promptly began to flit around the flailing figure, inflicting debilitating cuts and injuries onto it. With a final blow, the hollow fell back down to the ground, out of breath and too injured to move. As it heard the approaching footsteps of its foe, it felt paralyzing fear at the presence of the Shinigami who had casually manhandled it. A hand suddenly grabbed its hair before it experienced a rush of sound and abruptly found its face pressed up against the window it had been peering into previously. Too tired to put up any resistance, the hollow looked at the scene playing out in the room and its breath hitched in its throat. Inside, Orihime was kneeling before a shrine dedicated to her deceased brother and, from the looks of it, she appeared to be talking to the picture placed on it, perhaps telling it about her days so far. Seeing that the hollow was paying attention, Ichigo began to speak in a soft voice. Every day, when she has dinner, Orihime spends almost an hour talking to you, telling you about what happened during her day, keeping you alive in her thoughts and in her heart. Sora, you were her big brother, and as a big brother, you should have been happy when you died, knowing that there would be others to take care of your little sister, others to take over for you as her big brother, content with the knowledge that you had done your best by her. You see, we didn't take her away from you, Sora, no one can. By the time Ichigo was done, tears of happiness and regret were already trailing down the white mask covering Sora's face. Slowly, Ichigo descended with him back down to the ground. With gratitude shining in his previously maddened eyes, Sora opened his arms, exposing his body to Ichigo, silently asking to be set free, and with an understanding smile on his face, Ichigo granted his wish. After watching the last of the Ryutsu particles disappear, Ichigo slowly turned and looked straight at Rukia's form standing some distance away. From where he stood, he could easily make out the look of sadness in her eyes, but he chose not to comment on it. Stopping beside her, he crouched down, wordlessly indicating that she should hop onto his back. Standing to his full height, he leapt to the top of a nearby building, and with one last glance at the happy scene of Orihime laughing at something Tatsuki had said, he leapt back towards his home.